Our last speaker for our session is Mr. James Patton. He's the Executive Vice President of the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy. This nonprofit organization is one that I deeply, deeply respect. It's one of my favorites. And the founder is Douglas Johnston, who is on Global Peace Foundation's Global Advisory Council. But let me tell you about James. James Patton is the Executive Vice President. He has worked designing, implementing, and monitoring multi-stakeholder programs to promote economic development and mitigate violent conflict for decades in many, many countries, for over 20 years in a dozen different countries. Prior to joining ICRD, Mr. Patton worked as a Foreign Affairs Officer of the United States Department of State, with the USAID's Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation, and as a Deputy Regional Director of the Andean region for the American Friends Service Committee. Mr. Patton holds a Master of Law and Diplomacy from Tufts University, Fletcher School, and a Master of Divinity focusing on social justice theology from Harvard Divinity School. Let's welcome Mr. James Patton.
How's everybody doing? Ooh. Oh, I got a tough crowd. I know it's late in the day. We've heard a lot. This is an incredible group of peacemakers that we have here. We've heard a lot of technical stuff and aspirational stuff and value-related stuff. So I'm just going to tell some stories, if that's okay with y'all, and send you off to dinner with some things, hopefully, to think about. I'm going to frame them, however, in the context of a question. And the question is, what does it mean to be a religious peacemaker? I work in conflict, so my focus of the discussion will be around conflict questions, if that's all right with you. The most common theme that I've heard here on this topic is we all have shared values that we need to identify. We need to be able to put ourselves in the shoes of the other or wear the hat of the other and find where we connect. In other words, empathy. Develop empathy with the other. And thereby we can work with one another to create peace in the world. I want to challenge us as religious peacemakers to truly understand what this means, because peace is not constructed with our friends. Peace is constructed with our enemies. And it is easy to work together when you have those shared values. The hard work comes when the morality that we have is different. And if we cannot find a way to extend our empathy to those whose values differ from ours, even if they have values that we find to be destructive or grotesque or offensive, then we will not be able to connect with them, engage with them, and transform both them, their behaviors, and the world. So my organization, ICRD, has worked during its 14-year history in over a dozen countries around the world, including working with Pakistani madrasas to help transform the educational content and bring in critical thinking skills, working to reconcile different peoples in Kashmir, in Sudan, both north and south, before the peace agreement. We were trying to empower women peacemakers in Yemen. We have a project now in Syria with opposition leaders and different ethnic groups to avoid a retributive conflict. And we're launching right now a program in Colombia where I've spent a number of years myself to help reintegrate tens of thousands of active or potential former combatants from the war that's been going on there for over 50 years. We're utilizing women's networks and religious and spiritual leadership there, bringing together a diverse spiritual crowd, including indigenous shamans or holy men and evangelical pastors who have entirely different ethical worldviews. The indigenous shamans see their cosmology in terms of healing and in harmony, whereas the evangelical pastors take their command from God and Jesus, in the words of Micah, to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with their God. Despite their spiritual doctrinal differences, they're working together to build a spiritual safety net for those that are broken by war. And so I was in that context last month with 50 women peacemakers from different Christian religious groups, ecumenical group, in the hills of Cauca, a very conflict-impacted area in southern Colombia. Most of them were Protestant lay clergy or Catholic nuns. So I'm going to tell a story. It's going to be a Christian-based story because they were Christians. So forgive me, I hope that for those of you who are not Christian, this has some value. Okay, they each had personal stories of loss, and I'm going to draw from one of their tales to frame some of our discussion. A 70-year-old Catholic nun took the microphone at one point. She was very flamboyant and very, very energetic, and she started to tell the story in John chapter 8, where the locals grab an adulteress and drag her into the public square and throw her down in the dust in front of Jesus. And the Pharisees are standing side of him, trying to get him caught in a doctrinal trap. And they say to him, "The laws say that we must stone this woman. What do you say?" And so the nun is mimicking the people in the crowd, grabbing rocks, and mimicking Jesus drawing in the dirt while he considers his response before he gave his unforgettable reply, which we all know, that is, "Let the one among you who has not sinned cast the first stone." And so this 70-year-old nun starts to pretend she's dropping the rocks and sneaking out through the crowd so that nobody will notice her. And all of a sudden, she jumps up very dramatically, and she starts pushing her way forward again, and she says, "An old woman from the back started to come forward through the crowd, and she picked up a stone, and she let fly this stone, and she hit the adulteress in the head, and this trickle of blood ran down her face." And Jesus stood there and looked at this woman, dumbfounded, his mouth hanging open, and he said, "Mom, why do you want to embarrass me all the time in public?" Right? Mary, the one without sin. And, of course, the whole crowd of women peacemakers are laughing hysterically. And the nun just stood there, and she smiled, and she waited for them. And then she said, "We have to beware of the dangers of our own holiness." The dangers of our own holiness. And she followed with a very impassioned and very poignant discussion about the painful effects of too easily letting our blind interpretation of doctrine cloud our ability to actually discern the spiritual needs of those with whom we're working. She also talked about peacemakers undercutting one another because of the pride of righteousness. She talked about how women oftentimes are their own worst enemies in terms of finding voice and power in institutions that are largely dominated by men. And of course, she talked about the dehumanizing violence that we commit against one another, oftentimes in the name of a loving God. So what does it mean to be a religious peacemaker? There are a lot of practical responses, and I use them oftentimes in front of groups like the U.S. State Department when I'm trying to get funding for some of our projects. But I think those of us here who work in this know that there is something distinct about faith. If we limit ourselves to just the logical and the practical, then educational programs or vocational programs should be sufficient. But it's the power of religion, the power of its illogic, that actually adds something that these other things do not have. I recently met for the first of many workshops with former combatants in Colombia's war, those who are in jail waiting for trial and to be reintegrated, and some who have already gone through the process. And there are two stories that particularly struck me that they shared with me because of their similarities. So on the one hand, you have a young man who was raised in a middle-class family as a farmer, as a cattle herder, basically. And he was taught the ways by his father, and he was taught to protect his family and to provide for his family economically. And one evening, when he was 8 years old, they brought his father in, shot several times by what his father had always called socialist traitors. And he watched his father bleed to death on the couch, and then he joined the conservative paramilitary movement to get revenge. On the other hand, there was an indigenous woman whose hero was her older brother, who taught her to fish and to hunt and to play soccer in the dusty clearings in the jungle. And they were tasked with protecting their territory from mostly corporations who would come in to try to displace them by hiring paramilitaries to get access to their natural resources. And they rarely saw the government if the government wasn't there to protect the corporate leaders. She herself, when she was 7 years old, watched from behind a tree while her entire community, her parents, her brothers and sisters, and her friends were killed with chainsaws and thrown into the local church, which was then burned to the ground as a warning to others to not join the guerrillas. So, of course, she did just that. So what job program or education program will bring these two people and the tens of thousands of women and men like them back together in community in Colombia? How will they find a way into a society that is filled with people that are damaged by war? Because there's another truth to the human spirit, the one that allowed that 70-year-old nun to sit down with the men who killed her father and with tears running down her face ask them why. And those very men, also weeping, answered that they were sorry. That is what we hold as religious peacemakers, that tool that can help us cross the gulf between being broken in pain and being restored in hope. There is a power in the spiritual element of peacemaking that flies in the face of every intellectual and visceral reality when we were talking about conflict and the destructiveness of conflict, precisely because there is something there that is larger that can hold us as we step into that breach. The very principle of greater love has been demonstrated to work again and again, but I want to be cautious about not ignoring the difficulty of the task. Again, I've heard many people in the last few days saying that we share foundations in our faith, but I want to take a slight moral journey to the other side with you with my last 3 minutes, to where our faith might present us with the risks that exist so that we can truly empathize with the other. So I end by returning to the nun in Colombia, returning to John chapter 8. But I ask you to imagine that the person that's dragged before Jesus is not the adulteress. Instead, it's a militant, someone who is engaged in the worst horrors of dehumanizing violence, in rape, murder, the soulless act of willfully taking the most precious things that can be taken from a person, their dignity, their family, their autonomy, and finally their life. And he's not there asking forgiveness. He was dragged there. And in place of Jesus, and please ignore the fact that this is a Christian metaphor, put yourself as religious peacemakers in his seat, whatever your faith tradition. But not just as religious peacemakers, but as the victim of those spiritual perversions, as the parent of a raped daughter, as the sibling of a slain soldier, or the child of a kidnapped and tortured father. All done by the hands of the man who kneels in front of you. And in place of the Pharisees, put the policymakers who encourage retributive violence, institutionalized violence, revenge, instead of peace. The purging of the venom of all of that hatred by acting on it and institutionalizing. That is the moment where religion must find its ability to do peacemaking. Not just where the challenge is difficult, but where you physically burn with the pain of the injustices that you've experienced or witnessed, where every part of your human self wants to punish that person in front of you that's facing your judgment. You have the stone in your hand. You are right, and you are righteous. Until we can see ourselves in that position, until we can see in us the possibility that we can feel that same response, whether it be in conflict settings or whether it be in terms of greed, in terms of the environmental destruction of immediate corporate want, the failure to have a why, until we can feel that like that other person, we will not be able to use the greatest tool of spiritual peacemaking, which is empathy. We will not be able to understand and connect with that person and transform those behaviors. Beware of the dangers of your holiness, your own holiness, the nun said. And Jesus, to the adulteress, said, I will not judge you. either. So, last line, to love your enemy. To love your enemy is to want them healed. And by doing so, to heal ourselves. And that is the empathy for me, that in the face of such powerful fear and rage and pain and suffering is the basis for a moral foundation for change. That is what religious faith offers, and we have to act on it in every corner of our lives, every day, every step, because not many of our experiences and our challenges, I don't think, could be quite as dramatic as the ones that some of these women I was talking to have faced. So thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
Whoa. That was very powerful. Thank you so much. Let's express our appreciation for James.